Armando Hasurungan, biology and medicine videos. Please make sure to subscribe, join the forum group for the latest videos. Visit Facebook, Armando Hasurungan, make sure to like. And here you can also ask questions, answer questions please, and post something interesting, some interesting things, such as your artworks. And change the quality setting to the highest one for better graphics of this video. Now this is part 2 of the cell membrane series, and we're looking at the evidence of the fluid mosaic model. So what evidence is there to support this? Well, if we have a cell, and we freeze a cell, for example, and then we fracture it with a knife, you can say, we can be able to split the membrane, because part of the membrane will go on one side of the eyes, and the other will go on the other side, like so. And so using this, if we zoom into this section, we can see here is one layer of the lipid membrane, and here's the other layer. And so you can see that the lipid membrane is peeling, and you can do this by using scanning by electron microscope. So if we zoom into the cell membrane again here, the plasma membrane specifically, we can appreciate the sense of scale of the membrane, this plasma membrane specifically. And so, as mentioned, the plasma membrane is about 6 to 10 nanometers. A DNA in our body is 2 nanometers, so not that much difference. And a ribosome in the cytoplasm is about 25 nanometers, and these transcribe proteins, remember. So as you can see, the plasma membrane is pretty small. So if we look at one of these lipid structures again, just going over it again, just recapping, it's amphipathic, which means that one side loves water, the head group, and faces extracellularly, and the other side, the fatty acids here, hate water. So here, the fatty acids, they're hydrophobic, they don't like water. The head group is hydrophilic, it loves water. And we are concentrating on the head group because the head group can change. There can be different chemical groups attached to the head group, which changes its charge, structure, etc. So essentially, the membrane lipid, there are 3 types, or 3 categories, not 3 types. And the main ones, the head groups can be a phosphate to it or a carbohydrate to it. So one category, the membrane lipid, can be a phospholipid with a phosphate, a glycolipid with a carbohydrate, or it can be a sterol, which is, yeah. And sterols, essentially, which we will talk about first, is just cholesterol or ergosterol. And there are many others, but and we'll talk about these later on. But for now, let's concentrate on phospholipids and glycolipids. Now, phospholipids contain phosphate and can be divided again to 2 categories, to 2 parts. There can be glycerol phospholipids, and there can be sphingolipids. And they both contain phosphate on the head group. Remember, they contain phosphate on the head group. So glycerol phospholipids essentially contain a glycerol backbone with 2 fatty acid tails and a head group, a phosphate head group with X being any chemical group attached to it. A sphingolipid has, instead of a glycerol, a sphingosine backbone, 1 fatty acid tail, a phosphate, and an X. In this case, it's a C, which stands for choline. So it's a sphingolipid choline. Now, a glycolipid is similar. It can be divided into 2 parts again. There can be sphingolipids as well, or galactolipids, sulfate particularly. Sphingolipids has the sphingosine backbone and 1 fatty acid tail. And instead of a phosphate, it has carbohydrates, a mono or oligosaccharides. A galactolipid contains a glycerol backbone, same as a glycerol phospholipid. Glycerol backbone with 2 fatty acid tails, and again, a carbohydrate chain. And in this case, particularly a sulfate head group. And it should be noted that there are much more phospholipids in the cell than there are glycolipids. And that's why you might hear cell membrane being referred to as a phospholipid bilayer, because there's more phospholipids, and we'll soon see why. But essentially, these are not the actual structures of the cell membrane. The head group should be facing one way, and the fatty acid tail should be facing the other. So if we look back at one lipid membrane structure again, we know that there's a hydrophilic group, the head group, and a hydrophobic group, the tail, the hydrocarbon tails. right? So if we look back at the glycerol phospholipid, we have the glycerol backbone, the hydrocarbon, the fatty acid tails, facing down, and the head group, the phosphate, with the X facing up, facing the water. So it's similar in structure. Same with the sphingolipids. We have the sphingosine backbone facing down, essentially, with the fatty acid with one fatty acid tail, and the phosphate with the choline group in this case facing up, facing the water, facing the extracellular fluid or the cytoplasm. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic. This is same with the glycolipids containing the carbohydrates, the sphingosine backbone, and the fatty acid tail facing down, and the carbohydrate, either monosaccharide or oligosaccharide, facing up, facing the water. Galactolipids as well, the glycerol backbone with the two fatty acid tails facing down, and the carbohydrate chain facing up, facing the water. Now let us look at the different types of phospholipids and glycolipids there are found in the cell, the main ones. So as mentioned, the phospholipids can be divided into two classes, the phosphoglycerides, or the glycerol phospholipids, and the sphingolipids. The glycolipids can be divided into sphingolipids, and we won't talk about the galactolipids here. And also there are sterols, and we mentioned particularly cholesterol and ergosterol, and we'll talk about cholesterol later on part 3, I think, or part 4. So phosphoglycerides, there are many types. It begins with phosphatidyl. So there's phosphatidylcholine, there's phosphatidylethanolamine, there's phosphatidylserine, there's phosphatidylinositol, and there's phosphatidylglycerol. That's one class. And the other one, there's cardiolipin. And we'll look at each one of these closer later on. The sphingolipids, there are two main ones. There's sphingomyelin and sphingocholine. For the glycolipids, the sphingolipids, there are cerebrolipids and there's gangliosides, or cerebrosides and gangliosides. But we will be mainly concentrating on the phospholipids because there are there's more plentiful phospholipids in the cell membrane, I would say. So we'll look mainly at the phosphatidyl group and also the sphingomyelin. Now, talking about something different, this is a neuron, as you know, and a neuron contains myelin sheath. And now we will be looking at the different components of a cell, of the different membranes within a cell, including the organelles. So what we're looking at specifically are the components as in proteins, which are designated as black box, and lipids, which are designated as a red box. So the components will be in percentage from 0 to 100%. First is the myelin, which is essentially the myelin sheath wrapping around the exon. And it's composed predominantly of lipids, about 80% lipids, and the rest proteins, 20% proteins. Next we have the Golgi apparatus membrane. We're looking at the membranes, remember? And the Golgi apparatus membranes is composed about 55% lipids and 45% proteins. And remember, these are figures from a basic cell, not only a neuron, except the myelin, which is obviously a neuron. Plasma cell is composed about 50% proteins and 50% lipids. Now the outer mitochondrial membrane, because remember, the mitochondria has two membranes, the inner and outer, but the outer mitochondrial membrane is actually about 50% lipids and 50% proteins as well, similar to the plasma membrane. And then we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum membrane, which is a bit less, maybe about 45% lipids and about 55% proteins. And then we have the nucleus, which is predominantly proteins, about 60 to 65%, and the rest lipids. And the inner mitochondrial membrane especially is composed predominantly of proteins, about 80% proteins and about 20% lipids. So it's very different to the myelin. So from this diagram you can appreciate how the organelles within a cell are composed of varying amounts of proteins and lipids. So that concludes this video. Our next video will look at the differences between the membranes in the organelles and around the cell. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.